Russia always plays the victim. If Russia was a person, it would be a textbook toxic, malicious narcissist. Someone who breaks into your house, wants to keep your house and your family permanently, but when the cops arrive, that person screams how unfair everything is. When North Vietnamese communists attacked the South, the Kremlin went into overdrive on the information front. They were able to convince a lot of Westerners that this was a fight for liberation from oppression, not a fight for a new kind of oppression. America's involvement was painted as imperialism. When the Russians marched into Ukraine in 2022, they were playing the victim, of course. This special military operation was supposedly designed to save Russian speakers in Ukraine. The Russians can attack more European countries and call that a special liberation-happy operation. Even though Ukraine's military was extremely weak, neighboring Poland's military was extremely weak, Germany's military was extremely weak, Russia has been whining for years about NATO eastward expansion. In 1997, Russia signed the official contract and admitted they don't have the magical authority to tell other countries which organizations they could or couldn't join. Russia has many small and mid-sized nuclear-capable missiles pointing at Europe. It would take Britain 10 years of intense preparations to be ready for a conventional war. It would take Germany 15 years. And we don't even really have ammo. We barely have people who can physically fight. Poland was using 50-year-old tanks and so on and so forth, and we depended on Russian gas. Russia has had a secret alliance with China for decades, and there was no credible threat to Russia. The actual existential problem for the Russian regime was the regime itself. Please like this video, comment, share, and subscribe, and check out my ebook on old intelligence networks in Enlightenment and Communism. The Russian people overall avoided protesting against the authorities, but they didn't want to have children. That's also a form of protest, or let's say pragmatism. It's too much of an economic risk. You also have to pay bribes for everything regarding your children, to get them into a proper school, to avoid them having to do military service, and so on and so forth. It's a human risk as well. Younger women do not want to end up with an alcoholic husband. Therefore, the demographics of Russia have become disastrous. Instead of spending the money on the people, the oligarchs and bureaucrats bought private jets and super yachts and mansions. The government does offer some programs to help young couples with children, so there are incentives, but that's not enough. So forget all the whining by the propagandists of how the evil West was responsible for Russia's problems. In Russia, it's all about whom you know and whom you bribe. If you are attached to Putin's political party, if you complain as a citizen, and if you have constructive criticism and suggestions, you become a target of the secret police, just like in the old Soviet days. So people go about their jobs, they get through their day and hope for the best. And Russia has relied on lots of Muslim migration, actually. This is something they like to hide from Western conservative audiences. You know, this wouldn't play so well with them. So the Russians could run the projections. You know, the Russians could calculate what the future demographics will be in 10 years or 20 years or even later than that. And the calculations, they spell a disaster. The 2017 study, Russia's War with Ukraine is to Acquire Military-Industrial Capability and Human Resources by Jokal Johannesson from the School of Business and Law, University of Agder in Norway, says Russia wanted to get 40 million new people into their hands in the industry that is important to the war effort. Now, this was a rare kind of study, even though way many more people should have been looking into the same things. And the author draws an important comparison. Germany once took over Czechoslovakia to get access to 3.5 million Germans there and to the Skoda ammunition factories and to the Czechoslovak army with 35 divisions. In total, the Czechoslovak population of 10 million workers and soldiers was added to Germany's strength. This radically changed the strategic balance of power in Europe. That's how that went. Therefore, the study says we have ample reason to believe that the addition of the millions of Ukrainians to Russia, the acquisition of Ukraine's vast military-industrial complex, along with its huge stockpiles of Soviet-era weapons, etc., may have a very similar effect in terms of changes in the strategic balance of power in Europe. The 1970s census already showed that the Russian demographic tide was over. And the Russian share of the Soviet population, or Slavic share, 53% at the time, was beginning to decline. After the Stalinist purges and gulags, some people were actually a little surprised why people didn't bring more children into the world, in that area of the world. Ukraine also lost millions of people in the Holodomor, a famine orchestrated by Stalin in the 1930s, a demographic downturn from which Ukraine would never actually recover. In 1978, a young French scholar named Hélène Carrère-Dancros published a report called The Shattered Empire. She argued that the imbalance in population growth between Muslim and Slavic republics would lead to the legitimacy and authority of the Russian leadership being questioned or challenged. In 1990, Muslim republics accounted for 20% of the Soviet population, compared to just 13% in 1959. Population growth in Central Asia was significantly higher than in Russia. Russia is currently home to 15 to 20 million Muslims, making up 10 to 15% of the population. Yikes. Fertility remains much higher in Muslim-majority regions, with Dagestan holding the national record. According to the Grand Mufti, Muslims will make up to 30% of the Russian population by the mid-2030s. You know, if things proceed further in that fashion. Russia's natural population fell by more than 12 million between 1992 and 2010. So, between Putin's inauguration in 1999 and 2019, up to 2 million people had left Russia, and many of them are entrepreneurs, creative people, and academics. This is something the Atlantic Council think tank has looked into, and they calculated that. So this is the brain drain. 2 million qualified people, poof, gone. So this situation is tied to the other existential problem in Russia, the industrial production. To be a competitive superpower, you need more than nuclear weapons. You need engineers and specialized factory workers to make precision engines for vehicles and helicopters and submarines, for example. And everything is made from components. These bits need machines, which are made from other components, so this goes on and on. The industrial sector in Russia is a mess. The key people involved are too old. They're not making profits most of the time. And all throughout the Cold War, Russia had to buy and steal technology from the West. In the Soviet era, important industries were built in Ukraine. When Ukraine became independent, this posed a problem for Russia. In 2014, the takeover of Crimea was meant to secure the shipyards and roughly 2 million people. Next, Ukraine stopped the exports to Russia, and the Russians boasted they would become self-reliant within a few years, making all those rockets, engines, and so on themselves. But they couldn't, and it was not hard for the West to figure that out. Back in December of 2012, a group of experts from the Public Council of the Military Industrial Commission of the government of the Russian Federation submitted a report from which it concluded that the creation of a fully autonomous military-industrial complex in Russia is fundamentally impossible. The European Union Institute for Security Studies published a report entitled Defense Industries in Russia and China Players and Strategies in December of 2017. And it said Russia was desperately trying to buy complete systems from foreign countries. They wanted the Eurocopter light helicopters, the Mistral amphibious assault ships, and Iveco MRAP class armored vehicles. Now, of course, Russia tried to build its own light armored vehicle, the Gas Tiger, but they had many problems actually making these things, and they also had to buy components and bits from other country or source them from other countries. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, at the time, at least 826 types of weapons and armaments that were previously purchased from foreign suppliers were supposed to be produced in Russia between 2014 and 2025. Yeah, right. But every year, Russia became more dependent on imported systems. In early 2014, just before Russian-Ukrainian and Russian-Western relations reached rock bottom, Russia was estimated to have imported about 700 different types of products and components from Ukraine and another 860 components or systems from NATO countries. The Jamestown Foundation reported on the Russian intercontinental ballistic missile type SS-18. They said, however, it seems unlikely that the SS-18s will remain operational until this point, as the Yuzhmash plant, as a result of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine since 2014, is no longer involved in the maintenance of these intercontinental missiles. Maintenance was instead assigned to the Makeyev Space Rocket Center in Russia. However, according to Yuzhmash, the Russian facility cannot cope with this task because, among other things, it does not have access to the rocket's design documents. Isn't that interesting? With the SS-19 missile, the navigation and guidance systems came from Ukraine. So that's another problem. Today, according to one source, 70% of Russia's nuclear deterrent consists of the strategic rocket forces. But that figure could decline to 35% by around 2020 if the older ICBMs in the inventory cannot be kept operational. And in this context, the development of the other parts of the Russian nuclear triad must also be taken into account, including the modernization of the strategic bomber fleet, the introduction of the Tupolev stealth bomber, and the delivery of Bore-class missile U-boats. Therefore, Moscow faces the very real risk of a diminishing number of delivery systems for its strategic nuclear arsenal for some time to come. So it's not good enough to just make nuclear warheads. You gotta have the delivery systems, and they have to be competitive, and so on and so forth. So, the Russians ran the calculations on all of this. What would the Russian military-industrial complex look like in 10 or 20 years? The Europeans combined outspent Russia by a lot for defense. So each year the European Union would spend hundreds of billions more than Russia. Although the Russians can make certain things cheaper, the Europeans could, if necessary, convert conventional industry production into military production, so this is way more complex. After 10 years, the European Union would outspend Russia by trillions, a multi-trillion gap that will only get wider. And then you have to factor in possible game-changer technologies in the West. It could be something earth-shattering or just some new portable smart shoulder rocket system that can shoot a projectile costing tens of thousands of dollars to destroy a Russian tank that costs millions. So time is running out. The clock is ticking. The solution, it seemed to the Russian leadership, was a total blitzkrieg takeover of Ukraine. Pulling that off would bring in 40 million fresh new citizens and all of the industry. Russia could then remain competitive. Of course, taking Germany would be even better for the Russians. Then they would be a terrifying enemy for the US. In the NATO realm, there should have been a lot more discussion about all of this prior to 2022 and even prior to 2014. If more people had been aware of the situation, more preparations could have been made. When the invasion happened, Western politicians and media people kept avoiding the imperial calculations of Russia. The talk focused on Vladimir Putin, his personal ambitions and moods. Russians, of course, played the victim. Now, I can recommend the book The Wages of Destruction. about the German calculations for war before World War II. Instead of repeating the same old points about ideology, it lays down the cold calculations behind the rationale for war. Germany at the time had many farmers who desperately needed the space. Germany desperately needed a source for oil and steel. The leadership was hoping to take these things by force and not get into any major long-term trouble with the British and the Americans. So not taking Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland and other territories was deemed to be too risky by the German government. It would have meant the decline of the German Empire. To stay in the game, the decision for war was made. So lots of parallels to today's Russia. Next time you see some politician or influencer talk about Russia's decision to invade Ukraine, ask yourself, are you getting a proper analysis here? Is that person really qualified to judge these matters, or is this person bluffing? Is this person just repeating Russian talking points for whatever reason? You also have to wonder, how much did Western governments know about the Russian predicament and their calculations before 2022 and 2014? Why didn't we get the alarm bells ringing in public? And why do we hardly see anybody now talking about the Russian calculations? Please like this video, comment, share, and subscribe, and check out my ebook on old intelligence networks in Enlightenment and Communism.